Today I will be discussing retinoblastoma. Retinoblastoma is a tumor that is formed from the loss of function of the retinoblastoma gene, or the RB gene that's located on chromosome 13. It leads to a white reflex. This type of cancer occurs because the retinoblastoma gene is an important tumor suppressor gene. So if there are two hits to the retinoblastoma gene, then the cell continues to divide and causes cancer. However, there is a good prognosis. Retinoblastoma is inherited in an autosomal dominant fashion. However, it is also considered to be autosomal recessive at the cellular level. What does that mean? As you may know already, in autosomal recessive disorders, there must be two defective alleles in order for the patient to have the disease. This is quite similar to retinoblastoma. So even though the mutated retinoblastoma genes are inherited in an autosomal dominant fashion, what has to happen are two hits at the cellular level, which means that the patient could inherit, for example, one defective retinoblastoma gene and also inherit a normal retinoblastoma gene. So the first hit is the mutated retinoblastoma gene that the patient has inherited. The second hit occurs later on in life, where the second retinoblastoma gene becomes defective, in which case the patient will present with the disease. Let's take a look at what happens normally with the retinoblastoma gene and what happens in retinoblastoma. Normally, retinoblastoma binds to its friend cyclin/CDK. When this happens, retinoblastoma is hyperphosphorylated. It's really hyper and super excited that it got its friend cyclin/CDK. And since retinoblastoma already has its friend cyclin/CDK, it doesn't need another friend. In other words, it leaves E2F alone. Quite selfish if you ask me. But E2F is not upset because E2F can now move on to the S phase and move on with its life free from retinoblastoma. E2F didn't even want to be friends with retinoblastoma. It was just holding E2F back. So now E2F can move forward in life and on to the S phase, which leads to cell growth. However, when cyclin/CDK is not present, retinoblastoma feels lonely and it becomes hypophosphorylated. In other words, it's very sad and feels the need to make a friend. Retinoblastoma sees that E2F is all alone and decides to make friends with E2F, therefore binding to E2F and not letting it go. E2F is upset because retinoblastoma is the type of friend that just does not let it move on with its life and progress. So E2F does not allow for the progression of the cell into the S phase because E2F is kind of trapped by retinoblastoma, holding on to it so tightly. Now this is all normal and fine because retinoblastoma is a tumor suppressor gene, so it suppresses the growth of cells to prevent them from turning into cancer. But what exactly causes retinoblastoma? Like I stated before, there's a loss of function of the retinoblastoma gene. So if there's no retinoblastoma, then E2F is free to move the cell on to the S phase, which leads to cancer because there's no control of cell growth. The tumor suppressor gene, retinoblastoma, has been shut off. So the cell continues to divide and divide and divide, and that leads to retinoblastoma. Just as a side note, there are many regulators that affect the retinoblastoma gene that acts at the G1 to S phase transition. There's P16, also known as CDKN2A, that inhibits CDK4 and cyclin D, which inhibits retinoblastoma by hyperphosphorylating it. This is when retinoblastoma and CDK4 and cyclin D bind to each other. That's when the retinoblastoma is hyperphosphorylated, and in other words, it's shut off. So retinoblastoma can then no longer inhibit E2F by binding to E2F. Therefore, E2F can cause the cell to move on to the S phase.